Although you'll be receiving valuable advice from our host, please remember this is not therapy. It does not replace a relationship with a qualified mental health professional.
Good evening, I'm DR.GLUSS, and we're back with Engaging Minds. Every week we try to look at the issues we face, both topical, social, clinical, any important issue from a deeper point of view. And tonight we're going to focus on this concept of living to 100. And this is what inspired me to do this show. I work a lot with geriatric patients. And when I talked to one of my patients about doing this show, he had a great response. He said, why would I want to live to be 100? My life has become nothing but one big doctor's appointment. And then he said to me, well, if you could tell me how I could actually live, and what he meant is live in a quality way, then I would want to live to 100. But just to live the way I'm doing, I wouldn't necessarily want to live this way. And that's what made me think about it. And I thought, you know what, I need to pull together a panel of experts who are going to teach us how to live to be 100, but live with a life that has great quality to it. So with that, I'm going to introduce some of my panel here this evening. They're going to teach us, I would say, secrets, but they're not going to be secrets anymore because they're going to share it with us. So they are Dr. Neil Barnard, and he is a cardiologist. He's also the author of 18 books, and he's got some great information about how our diets affect the quality of our lives. Dr. Gary Small, he's the director of UCLA Longevity Center. He's also the author of a new book called Snap. He's going to tell us how we can change our personality in 30 days. And I can't wait to find out about that myself. Actually, I was telling him before that I would like to change other people's personalities, but that's a whole nother show. And then we got addiction specialist and internist, Dr. Damon Raskin. So with that, I want to welcome my panel to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thank you.
Dr. Raskin, Dr. Small, Dr. Barnard. Dr. Barnard, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for doing the show. It's great to have you on.
Great to be back with you.
Thank you very much. So, as I said, we're going to talk about the quality of life, not just longevity, but how you could live to be 100 and be healthy. So I'm going to start with Dr. Raskin and give you each a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and tell us what you think are some of the most important issues people have to face medically in order to have a quality of life and a long life. So, Dr. Raskin, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Well, in addition to my addiction practice, I do general internal medicine. I also work with a lot of geriatric patients, nursing homes and hospice patients as well. And I definitely see that there's a different group of patients that are really truly living as geriatric patients versus patients who aren't living, meaning, like you said with your patient, if they're chronically going to doctor's appointments, they are always feeling sick, they're always taking 12 different medications. And then I have a group of elderly patients who, for some interesting reasons, which I'm sure we'll talk about, are truly living. They're traveling in their 90s, they're socializing, they're getting out there, they're exercising, and I think a lot of it has to do with attitude and personality, which I'm sure we're going to talk about personality.
And diet.
Absolutely, and genetics. A lot of them have really, really good genetics. They'll tell me, oh yeah, my mom lived till she was 97 and my Uncle George lived till he was 94. So there is a big genetic predisposition, but I think a lot of it also has to do with good choices and lifestyles, which I'm sure we're going to talk about some more tonight.
Absolutely. And I do want to remind our audience, if you want to call in, the number is 1-800-222-5222. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions. Dr. Small?
So I direct the UCLA Longevity Center, and actually our tagline is living better longer. If you talk to the average person, they'll say, yeah, I'd like to live long if I could remain well, just as you pointed out earlier. And I think there's really a formula for successful aging, and the scientific evidence is compelling that this is the case. And many of the things we've already mentioned, diet, physical exercise is very important, staying socially connected. Loners don't do well. managing stress well, and also something very important is resilience, being able to adjust to some of the challenges of aging.
And I'm going to add to that before I bring Dr. Barnard in. I think also finding a purpose at different stages in your life. Again, dealing with clients over the years and seeing them age, where sometimes they lose certain abilities and then they have to sort of reinvent themselves. But if they could find a way to reinvent themselves with some sort of meaning, it seems to give them the energy and the inertia to continue on. Dr. Barnard, and I know you have a lot to add in addition to diet, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yes. First of all, by the way, I should clarify, when I finished medical school, I did a residency in psychiatry because I was interested in the brain. And although I'm now on the adjunct faculty in the Department of Internal Medicine at George Washington University, and I'm a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, I'm still trained as a psychiatrist. And part of the reason I think that's important is that even though we deal with diabetes and heart disease and all the things that cut life short, what they have in common, these things, is human behavior, which we have choices to make, and we respond to negative aspects of our culture that keep us hurting ourselves, that keep us addicted, if I can use that word, to bad foods. And if we die of a heart attack or the complications of diabetes or hypertension or cardiovascular disease, it's basically choices that got us there for the most part, and the choices relate to food. So when we look around the world at who does better, I guess many people are familiar with the blue zones that Dan Buettner and his group at National Geographic brought forth. They looked around and marked on a map, where do a lot of people live to be 100, and they marked them in blue. And so Okinawa is a blue zone because you have more centenarians there than anywhere else. And there's a part of Greece and Sardinia in Italy, and Loma Linda, California, as a matter of fact, is one of them. And what they all have in common is, and I think the most important feature, is that their diets tend toward plants and away from animals. They're eating less meat or no meat at all, and they're eating their vegetables and fruits and whole grains and beans. And that, to me, trumps absolutely everything else. I was talking with some people who were physicians during World War II, and they remarked how even though the populations of occupied countries were under tremendous stress, because the soldiers took away their livestock, they became effectively vegetarian and rather simple eaters because they had no choice. And heart disease went away. And so the point being, even though they're under stress and they have unenviable lives in so many ways, health comes back to the extent that your diet gets back to simple, healthy plant foods. So that's the theme that I'm sure we'll talk about many other things, but I want to focus on getting us toward a plant-based diet. A vegan diet is the healthiest, the exact opposite of how I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, but it's the way to go.
You know, there was an interesting article, I don't remember the football player's name, but it was in the LA Times Saturday. And I think he's a linebacker, and he talked about how his parents own a barbecue restaurant, how he has become vegan and has been able to lose 40 pounds and increase his energy. But what was interesting also, and I want to explore it about changing someone's diet, whether it's completely vegan or getting more healthy, is you have to change someone's psychology about how they eat. And I'm wondering, Dr. Raskin and then Dr. Small, about changing someone's personality. If someone comes into you and they're not eating the healthiest diet, a lot of times it's hard to get them to start thinking healthy because they think certain things are going to be taken away from them, the fun. They're not going to be able to eat the pizzas they want to eat. So I'm wondering how you would approach that in your practice.
Yeah, in my practice, we do talk a lot about diet and exercise, and I try to get all my patients healthier if I can. And sometimes it's a matter of showing them the negative consequences of what the diet is doing now. So I show them their cholesterol numbers. I show them their blood sugar numbers. We go over their blood pressure and look at what's happening to their bodies. And then I talk to them about baby steps. And I think that could be a very, very helpful way of, let's say, not making everything everything so drastic. Let's not go from being a carnivore and never eating a vegetable to being vegan. Let's start, with baby steps, and let's go slowly. And let's say, let's have meat 3 times a week, and let's maybe cut down on some of the refined starches and sugars and less of the pastas and white flour products. And, not say never, because I think if you say never, then that increases the patient's craving. They get obsessed about it. They start having more cravings, and then they say, you know what, screw it, I'm not going to go back to see this doctor. But if you can work with them, I think it just works so much better that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask, actually, I was just thinking that because when I showed the article to someone about a vegan diet, their response to me was, oh, that's too extreme. I could never do that. And I'm sure Dr. Bernard has a lot to say about that, but I'm curious, Dr. Small, as the personality expert, if someone is kind of rigid in their personality, how would you work with them to change their personality as you're advocating?
It depends on that particular individual, and they have to be motivated. I mean, as a psychiatrist, I've been fascinated on how to help people to change. I, too, work with a lot of people who are suffering from memory issues, and I'll do a standard medical workup, but I'll also get down to eat right and exercise, and often the response is, well, doc, do you have a pill? So it's hard for people to change. And I think strategies like taking baby steps, and when we think about personality, the first thing we have to convince people of is
you could change.
We can change it. Now, when I studied psychiatry, and we were talking earlier...
We're going to actually have to take a break, but I want to hear more. So, as you can see, the one thing I want our audience to get out of this, and these 3 experts are going to tell us, is there isn't a simple pill. It's a complex answer, but you're definitely going to have a lot more information at the end of this show than you did before. And we are back on the air. We're talking about how to really live to 100 and have a quality life. But before we start that, I want to mention sometimes, unfortunately, we have to face end-of-life issues. And I wanted to mention Mid-Valley Hospice in Sherman Oaks. They serve the greater Los Angeles area, and they are advocates and proponents of the End-of-Life Option Act here in California. And if you're a qualified patient and you want to find out more information about the work that they do, and actually our beloved Dr. Raskin is one of their physicians, you can call Mid-Valley Hospice at 818-403-3940. That's 818-403-3940, and that's Midlife Hospice. If you need to get that information from me, you can email me at drhowardgluss at live.com. So, Dr. Small, we have a caller in, and there's a question here directed towards you. And the question is, how does personality affect our health and outcomes, and how does it affect our lifespan?
That's such an important question, because that's why my wife, Gigi Vorgan, and I decided to write this book about personality, because our personalities have a huge impact on outcomes, on our relationships, our success in school, at work, our health outcomes, and even our life expectancy. It turns out that people who are more extroverted and more emotionally stable live better longer and have a lower risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. Now, you may scratch your head and think, well, why would that be? If you're more extroverted, you're going to have stronger social connections. You're going to be more outgoing, and that's going to reduce your stress. And we know people prone to stress do not live as long and have a greater risk for dementia.
So in your new book, Snap, do you cover some of the ways people can actually change their personality and reduce their stress and anxiety?
What we've done is taken the new compelling research that has turned upside down personality science. You and I, we learned that you can't change personality. It takes years of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis.
I'm sure Dr. Bernard had the same lesson.
But no one ever looked at personality as an outcome in intervention studies. So a group of psychologists did a systematic meta-analysis, one of the most powerful ways of looking at the data, and they found that self-help approaches, psychotherapy, or both actually can change all the personality traits and do it very quickly within a month. And what we've done, Gigi and I in the book, we've taken that science and translated it into practical strategies so people can make a difference in their lives.
I want to ask our caller, does that answer any of your thoughts or questions?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it. And actually, I'm going to ask Doc, thank you for calling in, and that's a great question. I'm going to ask Dr. Barnard to respond to that and maybe add how diet can also affect our personality and help us live longer.
Yeah, it's funny when we look at all the things where diet makes a big difference. Personality is probably the most poorly studied area. The Physicians Committee, the group that I had, did a big research study with Geico, the car insurance company, where we worked with their employees to institute healthy vegan meals at work. And our goal was to help them improve diabetes and weight, but what we found was that depression improved and anxiety improved and absenteeism went down. So something was happening. But let me come back to something that was mentioned earlier about patients won't change their diets, people won't change, or they would rather pop a pill, and we have to go just take tiny baby steps. Let me suggest a different way of thinking of this. When patients come in to see us at the Barnard Medical Center, what we first have to do is explain to them what food can do. So the patient has narrowed arteries, and their narrowed arteries are leading to chest pain that's stopping them from being able to play golf or go dancing or play with their kids. And you explain to them that animal products have fat and cholesterol that are keeping that narrowing happening. But if they get away from those foods, and they got to get away from them completely, that the arteries can open up again. This is the work of Dean Ornish. Or you explain that diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and they have never heard this before, diabetes is not caused by eating rice or potatoes. It's caused by the buildup of fat particles in your muscle and liver cells that cause insulin resistance. And it takes about 3 minutes to explain that to the patient. And then instead of saying, why don't you make a baby step and have meat half as often as now, what I'll say is, give it your best shot, but for a very short period of time, like 3 weeks. I want you to go totally vegan, and I will stand with you, and we have a dietitian that works with them and sets up a menu, and then we have classes that are totally free, and they can bring their reluctant spouse, and they never have to set aside their skepticism. They just have to give it a try. In the same way as when they're taking a pill, they're not sure if it'll work, but they'll give it a try. And what we find is that after 3 or 4 weeks, they discover that a vegan diet is easy. They're having spaghetti with tomato sauce instead of meat sauce, or the bean chili instead of the meat chili. It's not hard. And because they're making pretty big changes in reality, their arteries open up again, and their chest pain goes away within a month or 6 weeks, and they feel rewarded. If I said, eat chicken instead of beef or cut down, they never get any benefit, and they lose interest in it, and they'll go see a doctor who will give them a diet that works instead of one that coddles them and makes and doesn't enlist their help. So we try to give people a really good diet, but support them as they do it. And I've never seen anyone who can't do it. It's really not rocket science, and it's more important than any other aspect of their care.
Yeah, I agree, but I have to say I think there are two. I also agree with Dr. Russ, because I've had both sides. I've had patients so afraid of it that sometimes going a little gradual and then introducing them to something more extreme might work for them. But I definitely understand both point of views. And one thing I want our listeners to hear is that both of you advocating a healthier diet, and maybe the way in which you do it might be a little bit different. But I think it's important.
That's okay. We don't have to all read off the same hymn book. Everyone has a different approach. But our approach is to assume the patient wants to get well, and we assume that if they have a high cholesterol level, that is not a Lipitor deficiency. It's caused by the fact they're eating cheese and meat and eating things that bring cholesterol and animal fat into their diet. They have never heard the details, so you have to respect the patient enough to tell them the truth.
Absolutely, and I think that's what it's about, is respect. And I agree. I wanted to ask Dr. Raskin, as an addiction specialist, just sort of in your opinion, when someone comes to see you and they have an issue around addiction, how you think that might obviously affect their longevity, but affect the quality of their lives, and how would you approach the addiction?
Well, I think it's a huge deal. If someone has an addiction, that it can definitely, clearly affect their longevity. I mean, I'm seeing in my practice 20-year-olds dying of heroin overdoses, and I see this happen on a regular basis. We see it in the news, and it's really happening. I mean, so that's clearly cutting longevity way, way short. But nonetheless, we're talking about quality of life here. So I deal with alcoholics who are, quote, functioning in society, but yet their quality of life isn't good. And if they continue down that pathway, their relationships suffer. And then we talk about being a loner and being an introvert and being, just their best friend is the bottle. And this is going to definitely affect their quality of life and longevity. So I take the approach is, let's now work on this. Let's try to get this addiction under control and get you clean and sober, and then see the benefits there. And I think that that's a very, very important point.
So, everybody's personality is on a spectrum. There's no two personalities that are identical. And so everybody has strengths and weaknesses. So one size doesn't fit all. But for any approach in any of these programs, I think there are several elements that make it work. One is education. So people understand the connection between addiction or a bad diet or not exercising and their health and their longevity. Second is to try a program that works for that person so they can get started and start seeing results, because those results will motivate them to continue.
Absolutely. That's what Dr. Barnard's talking about, too, is that when people start to see results in their diet, hopefully it motivates them to continue. And
I think the other element that he brings up is helping people through it. Doing it alone is very difficult. But if you have a support system, a network, social network in place, it's going to be much easier.
Absolutely. That's just what I want our audience to hear. As you listen to our three experts and me throwing in some of my own psychology, you can see the complexity of the issue, and that getting the structure and creating a structure for yourself that works, that you could plug into, going through Dr. Small's program, seeing, Dr. Raskin as an addiction specialist, if that's your issue, but I also know he deals with geriatric medicine, reading Dr. Barnard's got 18 books out there, and a lot of them deal with food and healthy diet, but there's so much information out there, and people need to use it. And again, this is going to help you not only reach 100, but reach the quality of life that you're looking for. I wanted to, we're going to take a break in a minute, but I wanted to ask Dr. Raskin, one of the things that you do that is so unique is that you don't necessarily approach addiction like a one-size-fits-all. That's what Dr. Small is saying, that in your work that we do together actually through Concierge Detox LA, we found a way to individualize programs. So actually, we're gonna take a break, but we're gonna talk about it more when we get back. But all of our three guests take into account people on a personal level, and it's, as Dr. Small said, not a one-size-fits-all program. I was talking to Dr. Raskin before the commercials, where we talked about a service that he and I are working on. You might have heard the commercials, called Concierge Detox LA. But what inspired us to do it was we wanted to give individualized treatment and have people have an option that if they wanted to do the treatment in their own home, they could do that. So we're trying to find we were trying to get as specific as we can in our treatment. So with that, I wanted to address Dr. Raskin. How do you deal with people's individual needs as an addiction specialist?
Well, I think the key really is to find out where they are and then bring the treatment to them. So, for example, I have patients that, they're ready to quit, let's say alcohol, but they still want to smoke marijuana twice a week, So, I'll start with just meeting them where they are, and let's get them clean, and then let's get them into some good psychotherapy to understand the reasons that they still feel they need to escape. Let's figure out if they still have some underlying depression or trauma that they haven't dealt with. That's part of the addiction process. So it's not just about detoxing a patient with medications. It's very, very important to do that under a doctor's supervision, like myself, someone who understands that process. But you also have to go deeper and further to really figure out why they have gotten that addiction, and then to help prevent relapse, and then going on to live a long and healthy life, which is what we're talking about today.
Dr. Barnard, I wanted to go along with this concept of addiction. I work a lot with obese patients, and one of the things we talk a lot about is this concept of food addiction and how people are addicted to sugar, fat, and salt and use it as a drug. I'm wondering about your thoughts around that and how you work with those kind of patients.
10 years ago, we were funded by NIH to do a diabetes trial, and we were using a vegan diet versus a conventional diet. And on the vegan diet, people did great. Their diabetes would improve, they would lose weight. But I would hear people say, I crave cheese. And
I know you have that. Why don't you mention the book that you recently wrote about cheese?
Oh, well, because of this experience, I wrote a book called The Cheese Trap, because people would talk about cheese as if it was a drug. And it was specifically cheese. It was not ice cream or yogurt. It was cheese that they really wanted. Or I would hear people say, I could go vegan except for cheese. And I thought, what is that about? So we started to look into it.
Right.
And not only do people treat it as a drug, we found out that there are actually opiates in cheese. The casein, casein, casein protein in milk, which is concentrated in cheese, has coded into the protein sequence opiate compounds called casomorphins that do attach to the very same brain receptors that heroin or Demerol or any other narcotic would attach to. Now, don't get me wrong; they're not anywhere near as strong, and they won't get you arrested.
I kept on thinking about overdosing on cheese, but
well, people will do that.
Right.
If you go to the cheese bar at a party and you linger a little bit too long, and then the next day you find people very often find that they're all constipated, and they didn't realize, but it's the same effect as having any other narcotic. If you had a narcotic painkiller after surgery, constipation is the number one side effect. Well, cheese happens to have opiates in it. It's the only food I know of, one of the very few foods that actually have actual opiates in them. And so you're sending them straight into your digestive tract, and you get constipated with it. Now, that's not going to kill you, but if you're hooked on cheese and it's 70% fat and very high in cholesterol and sodium, and you're gaining weight and getting sick from it, in the same way as an addiction to alcohol or tobacco or illegal drugs can get you into trouble, an addiction to food, whether it's cheese or sugar or meat or whatever it is, can get you into trouble too, because it leads to habitual use of things that are really harmful to us, despite the fact that we all grew up with them thinking that they're normal.
I have to say, as a person who grew up in French Canada, and a lot of my friends are French, I could imagine their thought around giving up cheese, how it would just be, seriously, culturally so difficult for them to wrap their heads around that concept.
But it would be a fantastic idea, because when you look at the so-called French paradox, for example, much of the reason that France was a healthier nation back in the past was because they had regional cultures, and in the south of France, they did not consume butter and dairy products. Those were northern things. In the south, it was olive oil and vegetables, and a somewhat more plant-based diet, although certainly not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And now, of course, cheese has invaded everywhere, right. and people imagine that it's somehow this age-old tradition, but it's actually a relatively new tradition.
And since we're talking about the concept of addiction, I wanted to talk to Dr. Small about how important relationships are when it comes to addiction and the psychological theory of attachment, which a lot of our audience aren't aware of what that theory is. So I wonder if you can share that information with us.
So certainly relationships are very important to our lives. We're social animals. I mean, this is one reason we're all addicted to our smartphones, because we want to check the latest text message and social media posting and so forth. So we really crave being with others. And our personalities, to some extent, dictate how much we crave that or not. So if we look at extroversion as one of the big 5 personality traits, if you ask the average person, they'll tell you if they're an extrovert or an introvert. About 1/3 of the population, they're introverts. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because introverts are good listeners. They complement extroverts tremendously, because if you have a relationship with an extrovert,
2 extroverts, it might be difficult.
Well, that can be fun too, but what
Right.
tends to happen is the context of the relationship will change your personality traits to some extent. So if you have 2 extroverts, one of them will overpower the other. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's not. In fact, in SNAP, we talk about relationships like that, how it can be positive or negative. If we think about addictive disorders in relationships, it's critically important. And most of the addicted personalities do much better when they get in a peer group all these people are working to fight their addiction. So they have that mutual support, and it helps them substitute, whether it's cheese or alcohol or whatever it may be, for now these positive relationships that will bring them beyond the addiction, which
and
is
that's why
lives.
AA can be very helpful for a lot of these patients. NA, AA, all those.
Yeah. Do you think that I know why don't you share with our audience, you've written books about technology in the brain. Since we're talking about that, how do you think technology has affected relationships? And I know it's a very general question.
Well, I think it's mixed. I mean, technology has its upside and its downside. I think a lot of it is good in that it makes our social relationships much more efficient. You can text someone and meet them and stay in touch with family at a distance and so forth. But I think there's a lot of negative too, because we have a tendency to relate more to our devices and less face-to-face. And I think it's been particularly challenging for young people who have been coined the digital natives, who grow up with this technology, and they haven't really developed their face-to-face human contact skills. When you talk to them, they may not look you in the eye. They may not notice nonverbal cues in a conversation. I think those face-to-face interactions are tremendously powerful, and we don't want to neglect them.
It sounds like we're almost developing autism.
Well, people have argued that we have kind of an autistic society as a result of all the technology.
Which is very sad. I mean, it's
absolutely. Yeah. So what you're saying is that relationships can definitely help us live longer. Positive relationships.
But but I don't want to bash technology entirely, because even when we talk about personality change, I mentioned self-help can make a difference in personality. And there's a lot of therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, which you can get online. And there have been systematic studies showing it's extremely effective, almost as effective for some people as a face-to-face therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to mention to our audience that Dr. Small is going to be involved with a conference. It's called Relationships and the Health. Promoting Power of Connection Across the Lifespan. It's coming up March 16th to 18th. It's at UCLA, and I assume you're going to be one of the presenters?
I'll be one of the presenters. We have a number of wonderful presenters like Daniel Siegel, Damasio, and others. It's really a riveting conference. It's the most fun I've had at a conference in my entire career. It's 3 days, March 16th through 18th, and you can only sign up for one day if you haven't got the whole weekend. And
I do want to tell our audience that if you want to get more information about that, you can call 310-475-2505, or you can always email me at drhowardgluss@live.com. So we're talking about how people can live to 100. I wanted to also talk about, all of you deal with geriatric patients. Are there specific needs that geriatric patients need to have, let's say, Dr. Raskin, medically?
Oh, absolutely. I think geriatric patients in general do have a lot more needs, and we have to, as caretakers or as physicians, really understand the aging process to really try to help them, in these ways. But things change as we get older. I'm sure, the audience knows that, right? As we get older, our bones change, our joints can change, our brain changes, as our esteemed colleague here knows.
Actually, we're going to take a break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about memory changes and how that can affect the lifespan, because Dr. Small and all of our panel are expert in the issues of memory. I'm Dr. G. We'll be back right after the commercials. I keep stressing this, a quality life and live longer and maybe live to 100, which would be fantastic, but as long as we have a quality of life. And one of the issues that a lot of people face as they get older, as a person who deals with geriatric patients, is issues of memory and some health issues. So I want to start with Dr. Raskin. We were talking before the break about what specific needs you see in patients dealing who are older.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just for example, our physiology changes. As we get older, blood pressure tends to get higher, so we just have to be more vigilant about that. People tend not to exercise as much. They're not as motivated in general, so we have to be, more conscious of diet and exercise like we're talking about. There's obviously more cancer at higher ages, so we have to be more sort of vigilant about cancer screening and making sure that patients are aware of some of those signs and symptoms. symptoms, for example.
And Dr. Small, you've actually written a lot of books about Alzheimer's and dementia and memory training. As someone who's taken your course at UCLA,
thank you.
Can you share some advice to our audience about how to deal with some memory issues?
So age is the greatest risk factor for developing memory issues. By age 65 or older, the risk for dementia is about 10%, where your memory is really interfering with your life. By age 85 or older, it's almost 50%. The good news is that it's not all about genetics for the average person. In fact, for the average person, modifiable risk factors have a bigger impact than what we inherit from our parents. Physical exercise is tremendously important in terms of keeping the brain healthy. Diet, we were hearing about the vegan diet. There's been a lot of studies showing that antioxidant fruits and vegetables are associated with better memory, as are omega-3 fats from nuts, fish, or flaxseed. Avoiding those refined sugars and processed foods is tremendously important. And another big hit on memory is midlife obesity. That increases your risk for late life dementia, also increases your risk for diabetes. If you develop diabetes, it doubles your risk for dementia. So I think a lot of this is tied in to heightened inflammation in the brain as we age. And a lot of these strategies like physical exercise, getting a good night's sleep, consuming omega-3 fats, all these lower inflammation. In fact, at UCLA, we just reported a study where we looked at curcumin, which is a spice from turmeric. And we found that when people took this, who just had mild age-related memory complaints over an 18-month period in a double-blind study, they had significantly better memory after 18 months than if they took placebo.
And Dr. Bernard, I'm wondering what your thoughts around this are, because I'm sure you have some very interesting opinions.
Well, the data on Alzheimer's and food have just exploded in the past few years, and I agree with the comments that you were just making about exercise and diet. In Chicago, at Rush University, there's a huge research study called the Chicago Health and Aging Project. And starting in 2003, they began publishing really important findings, and saturated fat, which is in dairy is the number one source, meat is number two. Those people in Chicago who eat the most saturated fat, they're not just at risk for heart disease, they're at about triple the risk of Alzheimer's compared to other people. And then they looked at trans fats, which is in a lot of snack foods. Same story. It increases the risk not just of heart problems, but of Alzheimer's. And so if you flip this around and say, well, what if I'm not eating those bad foods? Will my risk drop? And the evidence suggests yes. And then at the University of Illinois, researchers found that exercise, if you lace up your sneakers and have about a 40-minute brisk walk 3 times a week, your memory problems are less likely to occur, and shrinkage of brain structures like the hippocampus, which is central to memory, that shrinking can actually be reversed. And I got so excited about this, I actually wrote a whole book called Power Foods for the Brain a few years ago, because when my father and of course my grandparents, when they succumbed to dementia, you'd give anything to go back in time and share with them what science has now shown us about the antecedents to this condition.
And, I'm going to sort of put in my 2 cents. I just keep on thinking about some of the clients I've dealt with who are aging, or some of them even having loved ones or themselves dealing with dementia. And I know I mentioned it earlier on in the show, but it seems to me that when people lose certain abilities, it causes a lot of depression, especially if they're aware of it. And somehow, if I could work with them and find a way for them to find some sort of meaning in their life as to where they're at that point in their life, and they can still feel active and relevant. That seems so important for people, that they still feel relevant as they get older. I'm not going to say it's a direct relation, but it seems to improve I mean, you guys are probably more of an expert on it, but it seems to have some sort of effect, not just on their longevity, but on their quality of life. As one of my patients always says, well, I sort of have a reason to get up in the morning, and that makes a big difference. We have a few minutes left on the show, and I want to, I know a lot of times people have something that they want to share that maybe they haven't had a chance. So I'm just going to go around the panel and ask you to just share any couple of thoughts that you don't want to walk off the show and say, I wish I would have shared that on the show. So I'll start with Dr. Raskin.
I just want to say I have a lot of patients who are in their upper 90s right now and who are living well. And some of the things that they have in common are, well, they do see me regularly, which is a good thing, because I think it's important to have a connection with a doctor and make sure that they get checked and be vigilant about their symptoms. I think that's important. But what you're saying about attitude, I think, is also really key. I mean, I have a woman, she's 94, she's taking French, she's taking photography, she travels to Africa with a group, some National Geographic group, so she's always involved, and I think that's really the key that I see in longevity. It's about, the relationships that I develop with my patients. I really get to hear some of this. It's not just about treating a condition or a disease, and I really enjoy hearing about that, and I think if people want to live longer, they have to have that attitude and that excitement, that extrovert that you were saying before, and I think that is a really, really important part of this.
And those relationships that Dr. Small was talking about, they're not just about, let's say, romantic relations. There are all kinds of personal relationships with your doctors, relationships with friends.
Absolutely.
I wanted our audience to hear that too.
Absolutely.
That becomes very inspirational to people. So, Dr. Small?
Well, I'm hoping the message from this show is one of empowerment, that we really all have much more control over our lives than we realize. If you look at the MacArthur study of successful aging, and they defined success as physical and mental success, it was a formula. Only about a third was attributed to genetics. That means 2/3 may be up to ourselves. And personality is key. It really drives it. It's important about the relationships. If you want to know more about it, please pick up a copy of SNAP. And if you want to hear more about it at our conference, just Google UCLA Longevity Center, and you'll find out about the Relationship Conference, March 16th through the 18th. And by the way, just searching online will give your brain an exercise.
That's interesting to know. And Dr. Barnard?
Yeah, just really quickly, let me resonate with what's been said. And in simple terms, genes are not destiny.
That's right.
The genes for blue eyes, those are dictator genes. You're going to have blue eyes. But the genes for diabetes or heart disease or Alzheimer's disease, those are not dictator genes. You're just because something runs in a family doesn't mean you're going to get it. Those genes are more like committees that make a suggestion. So if we change our diet in a big way, if we start getting exercise, if we treat our bodies differently, many of these things don't have to happen. And that's why I make a big pitch for making big changes, but work with other people so that we can make the changes together, whether it's quitting smoking, quitting an addiction that's got you in its grip, or getting away from foods that you may love but don't love you back. We can make these changes, and you really can live in a much healthier body than you may feel was possible.
And Dr. Barnard, if people wanted to find out more about your work or how to get in touch with you, how could they do so?
Well, thank you for asking. My organization is the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. PCRM.org is the website. And my two most recent books, one is called The Cheese Trap, which I mentioned earlier, but I have a brand new book that's just coming out this coming week called Dr. Neil Barnard's Cookbook for Reversing Diabetes. And it's a beautiful book, I have to say. So I was very pleased with how it came out, and I hope people put it to work.
Thank you very much. And actually, Dr. Raskin, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how could they do so?
Well, my office is in Pacific Palisades, and I have a website. That's drdamonraskin.com or damonraskinmd.com.
And, we still have a couple of minutes left. I keep thinking about how this all interacts. And what I wanted our audience to get out of this show more than anything is the sense of that living longer is a complex issue, but if you look at your diet, if you look at your psychology, if you look at your personality, if you look at perhaps issues of addiction, that if you face them and find a real way to deal with them, and through the information on the show, whatever resonates with you, some things may resonate more than others, and you may turn around and go, you know what, I really need to work on my diet, or I do have an issue with addiction, or, my personality is driving me crazy and everyone else around me pretty crazy. So I'm going to pick up Dr. Small's book, and I'm going to try to make some solid changes in my life. That was the purpose of this show. So, I have to ask Dr. Small this one last question. One of the things that I've talked to many psychologists about when they knew that you were going to be on the show, they said, personality is solid. It doesn't change. I don't understand how it could change in 30 days. So with 1 minute left.
Well, that's what got Gigi and me to write this book. I mean, I was skeptical myself, but it turns out there are some psychologists from University of Illinois who for the first time looked at all the studies where interventions like psychotherapy or self-help were targets for research in personality. And they found, guess what? After 30 days, you see significant and meaningful change, and it can transform people's lives. So it's really a book about hope and about empowerment.
And that's what everyone is giving here. I mean, Dr. Raskin, in your individual care, how you give hope to people. And what I love about what you're talking about is the relationships you create.
Absolutely. And it's that relationships, it's understanding where patients are coming from that helps me motivate them and makes them continue our relationship and then keeps them on a positive course.
And actually, Dr. Barnard, how you help people change their relationship with food. That you have a very specific way of dealing with it, and it's been incredible, obviously, and changed a lot of people's lives. So I want to thank everyone for their empowerment, and that's what we started the show off. We were going to give our audience a sense of empowerment, how they can change their life through diet, exercise, their personality, how they deal with stress, addiction, and how they deal with their food. So thank you very much for coming on the show. We'll be back next week. I'm Dr. G. If you want to call me anytime during the show or next show, it's 1-800-222-5222, or email me at drhowardgluss@live.com.